See, the last page is my conclusions. And if you read my column in The Contact, which just came out a couple of days ago, I had said that we're so overburdened with what's going on in the political world, in the changes that are happening in the country, and many of us are feeling very insecure and afraid, and we're paying attention to all kinds of issues. Right now, most urgently, the issue of dealing with the government trying to process undocumented immigrants. We're carrying all this heavily on our hearts. And I said that I was intentionally going to try to steer away from talking about that, and instead to start working our church services more to those things that sustain us and that bind us together and that hold us. And as you'll see this morning, I'm pretty lousy at doing that. I started with that intention, but that's not where it went. Anyhow, we speak of the individual search for truth and meaning. What is truth? Is it the same, I'm reading the description of this sermon and not the sermon. Didn't feel like the words I wanted. Until last summer, the UU bylaws included 7 principles that UU congregations agreed to affirm and promote. And although we altered the language we use to describe our shared ideals, these principles remain an important part of our legacy and our identity. And indeed, most of them are preserved somewhere in the new language. Of the 7 principles, I would claim 1. It was the 4th principle. You don't need to know which that is. To be uniquely and quintessentially UU. This is the principle that declares our agreement to promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. For a denomination that's grown from Protestant Christian roots, this language is revolutionary, as it explicitly moves the responsibility for forming religious understanding from the teachings of the church to the conscience and convictions of each individual. Indeed, to highlight this posture, our bylaws also specify that congregations, we have very few rules, but one of them is that congregations cannot require members to adhere to a particular creed. If we do that to you, we're not a UU congregation. Now, for years, most people's understanding of what I will call ultimate truth was guided and constrained by the teachings of the church. When an omniscient and omnipotent God is presented as the creator of our universe and the arbiter of our souls, the church faithful tend to fit most of their explanations of life into a framework defined and managed by their understanding of God. Things are the way they are as a result of God's plan and design, and concepts like what is true are tempered by filtering our thoughts through a lens of belief and a certainty that the divine hand is involved in all of creation. The conclusion here is that for the strict adherent of a dogmatic faith, the idea of truth is closely tied to that of belief. And the church teachings provide the authority for interpreting our life and our world through our religious understanding. The meaning and purpose of life is expressed with notions like honoring and pleasing God or submitting to God's will. Life, death, the afterlife, the past, and the future are all God's creation. And it is an arrogance and possibly a heresy to think that we humans have much agency in how things manifest. One reason that the Christian right in this country can so readily ignore issues like global warming and the impending threat of climate change because they actually believe that whatever will happen is part of God's plan for us and our world. Those that trust in God believe that the divine hand will protect us from these apparent problems. Those who fear God might believe that this is a trial of faith and that we get what we deserve in this world. Many also believe that whatever happens in this life is really just foreplay anyway, and that our eternal life is the big deal, the real deal. But by liberating belief from prescribed church dogma, our UU faith removes any necessity that we interpret our world through a vision of the divine hand or whatever else it is that churches teach. We assume that every person, each person, possesses enough intelligence and insight to form their own ideas about anything that might be termed ultimate reality. And it is our responsibility as thinking agents to form and explore the meaning and purpose that we attach to our own lives. We empower ourselves to interpret and analyze the lives we are living, how we relate to one another, and how we view the world and universe that we inhabit. Some of us continue to hold an idea of an external and powerful God force. Many of us believe that there are some spiritual or physical forces connecting us in ways we don't really understand. And some of us believe that only the natural order of science is essential to understand our relation to the world. This freedom to hold different beliefs is the gift that Unitarians and Universalists brought to Christianity. We are charged with being the seekers, being the doubters. Now, in a way, I'm not being really fair in my description of the church, at least in these current times, but only because many modern churches diluted their original dogmatic message and have adapted to a more nuanced approach to God and God's will. In many ways, the churches are adjusting to a world where they do not control the entire narrative and where they must adjust to the presence of once heretical sects like us and to the growing number of non-religious persons in our midst. Indeed, most of us, although by no means all of us in our culture, have to grapple with questions about what is true and how we assess truth in our lives. Even just a decade ago, I would have thought that discussing absolute truth would be a fairly direct task in most cases. We rely on our observations, we rely on reason, and we rely on the cumulative growth of scientific knowledge to support most of the assertions that we know to be true. Clearly, there's much that we don't understand yet, and there are limits to what has been explored through science. But in my book, science is gradually providing acceptable answers to some of the biggest questions posed in religion: how our world and universe were created, how our species emerged, and even what happens when we die. These explanations can seem uncannily frustrating, especially because of the extent to which they rely on chance occurrence and behavior. I think we would all like to see ourselves as the pinnacle of something resulting from guided design. However, our existence is magnificent in its complexity and elegance, even in the absence of a creator force. I claimed that explaining truth might have seemed easier a decade ago. My new disclaimer is that we are learning, and not in a good way, that what appears to be true is also subject to contention through political argument and bluster. The standard of relying on the scientific method and reason is no longer the sole basis, evidently, that we hold for accepting truth. We now live in a time of fake news, alternative facts, and creative disinformation and spin. What we learn and how we learn it, for most people, is the result of how we're exposed to different narratives about what is true. And these can be quite biased and self-serving and manipulative. Too often, it is the loudest and most colorful voices that win the day. We've become increasingly aware of the impact that cultural and political biases can have on all knowledge. This is the idea of postmodernism. It's probably easiest to see in history, where we know that, for the most part, history is written by the victors. Not just interpretation, but the facts themselves are subject to distortion and editing. Entire episodes are deleted because they do not serve the interest of those telling the stories. I'll give a quick, simple example here that I learned a lot about when I visited our church in Tulsa, Oklahoma a few years back. We've recently seen many descriptions of the Greenwood Massacre, an action that took place in Tulsa in 1921. A successful African-American community known as the Black Wall Street was burned entirely, and at least 300 people were probably killed in a racially motivated conflict. Because of recent efforts to document and describe the events, it is now a well-known tragedy, and it was actively publicized a few years back on its 100th anniversary. But for most of the 20th century, it didn't exist in histories or even in local lore. In Tulsa itself, very few white residents knew that this riot had ever occurred, and it was spoken of only in whispers in the Black community. It took active efforts of restoration by a few committed historians who really started this in the 1990s to reintroduce the world to this history. And now we know it well. But the whole thing was erased. Even many well-known truths are fabricated, cleansed, and made nice for public distribution. Alternatively, we can use narrative to expose persons or groups to public contempt. Negative advertising in political campaigns is an unfortunate example and one that we're all too familiar with. Words hold immense power and readily convey a point of view. Consider persons involved in violent political opposition. Depending on who is speaking, they might be honored as freedom fighters, or they might be vilified as terrorists. And the same act can lead to both designations. What I'm getting at here is the idea that most of the time, what we hold as truth is relative. There is such a thing as objective truth, or at least things that approach objective truth. Everything we know is subject to revision if we find new facts or theories that describe them more accurately. But for most things we know well, scientific type things especially, this is unlikely. But beyond the realm of factual scientific type knowledge, most truths in our world are relative. They depend on context, and they depend on who holds them as truths. Now, I may be misusing words here. If something is only a reality in context, maybe we need a word other than truth to describe it. Maybe opinion or position or something else is more accurate. But this is hiding the fact that even relative truths are still true, at least for the persons who hold them. Viewing truth as context dependent doesn't diminish its value or its strength. It invites nuance and thoughtful engagement with differing perspectives, and it recognizes the power and the agency of the person defining and holding that truth. When we speak to one another about the individual search for truth and meaning, we are presuming that there is no single correct answer, no single truth we should all find as we pursue our separate searches. It's not like we all go off and look around and come back to the same place, and then we form our creed. That's not what's happening here. The critical word here is meaning. We are each located differently in life, with our individual networks of involvement, our personal interests, and our specific emotions and concerns. The things that hold the most importance in my life, right now these center on my wife, my daughters, my granddaughters. They include my home and my community, and they extend to the congregation of Beverly Unitarian Church. But these are specific to me. Sure, I share parts of them with others, and I share some ambitions for them with others, but the perspective is mine alone. My sense of the meaning of life, the purpose of my life, is fundamentally tied to those I love and are most familiar with. And yes, some things I hold as very important extend to a much broader domain than just my particular social circle. I carry very much that we behave with care and compassion, and that justice and equity extend to all persons. I carry very much that we are all protected from pain and suffering to the extent possible. But at the end of the day, I'm still probably more selfish than not in regards to where I find and hold personal meaning in my life. And I assume that we all are, and that in many ways we all should be so. Those of us who do the best are those who can extend their bandwidth to attend to the concerns that involve all people after they first worry about their personal circle of loved ones and friends. One reason we support the individual search for truth and meaning is because we realize that each of us can and should find different truths that work for them, that help their world feel right. We each have different guides to that, which feed our inner needs and help us to grow and thrive. And our beliefs, our understandings, our truths, they only make sense within our particular life context, in our own story. But before I stop, I want to return for a few minutes to the threats posed by public narratives that play with the truth, or misrepresent what should be understood as objective and shared truth. These narratives abound, and bias is inherent in most history, most news reporting, and almost everything. But it seems worst in politics, where they are not usually interested in the truth at all, but rather selling a narrative that serves an agenda. Our hope for political dialogue is that it would be open-minded exploration that considers facts, points of view, and raises hope that we might come to a reasoned conclusion and maybe find and share a truth. Instead, the political climate is one of rampant bias, increased polarization, overt lying and use of non-truth, and appeals to base emotions. It is also beginning to repress much information and censor what is made available to the public. And this is where I really wander into the current things. I'm sorry, I couldn't stay away from it. Several events just this week point to the extreme assault on truth and on decency that we will need to contend with on an ongoing basis with the current administration that finds itself in power in Washington. The first, and I think the most egregious, was the casual and entirely uninformed explanation of the tragic airline helicopter crash as the result of DEI programs, diversity, equality, and inclusion. Such programs, whether they're in the military or among the air control system or the airlines themselves, without any information, President Trump turned an occasion of deep sadness into an opportunity for political coup counting, and including a racist dog whistle. As thoughtless and insensitive as this response was, it probably served his agenda well, because the more you hear something like DEI is the problem, the more it will become heard and unfortunately probably believed. The second and more predictable case was the executive order made in the name of defending women. In this case, they're defending women from gender ideology extremism. What they're asking is that any federal support of gender ideology be restricted. In particular, redacting or removing any information that supports differentiating gender from sex at birth. The term gender ideology extremism is not well defined, but it has gained traction among transgender rights opponents who argue against the idea that people can identify with a gender that does not match the sex they were assigned at birth. The executive order actually refers to, quote, the false claim that males can identify as and thus become women and vice versa, unquote. Now, we expected cultural wars with this presidency, and we knew that DEI programs in gender identity would be center stage issues. But both of these examples are truly menacing and remind us of how much work we have to do to protect our version of the truth in America. I have no idea how these minds work. In particular, I'm confused about why anti-transgender initiatives are framed as a defense of women, as if men are never involved or affected by transgender rights issues. Somewhere in these misogynistic minds, women are the ones at risk. Who knew? Continuing on, truth is truth. It is what we can prove until we prove something different. What we collectively hold is true is a social product of those truths we have a consensus about. Scientists have other criteria, but they must still win the war of narratives to convince us. Crazy narratives, conspiracy theories, all kinds of wackadoodle assertions seem to be on the rise. The threat of a COVID pandemic brought much of this to the foreground, with activist anti-maskers and calls for old treatments like bleach and horse tranquilizers. Certain mandated interventions, like vaccines, seem especially prone to misinformed attacks and the repetition of disabused arguments. But as much as it may seem counterintuitive, the important truths for most of us are subjective, contextual, relative, and personal. I will form opinions and maybe beliefs about the things like what happens when I die. And these beliefs help guide me in how I pursue life. In this case, I believe that my entire existence ends at my death. So I believe that I must live for enriching experiences and enjoyment in this lifetime. What remains will be legacy, it will be memory, but it won't be me. That's my belief. There is nothing profound in claiming that meaning and purpose are personal. All that is new here is claiming that for me, they are the truth I live by. I still need to evaluate them, and I still need to discern whether they remain consistent with my other values and expectations. And others can challenge me. You can challenge me about how I hold meaning, and I, in turn, can challenge you. What we have to worry about is when our truths fly in the face of a number of well-established facts. That is one reason we encourage each other to share our ideals, our thoughts about meaning and purpose, and work through these questions with others for feedback, for integrity, for honesty. And not just because something is held up as truth. Even if it is personal and relative, it does not mean it's beyond questioning. When your truths portend harm for others, I trust that all of us will call you out and ask for change. And when our government frames truths that portend harm and unfairness, I trust that each of us will call them out and ask for correction. And that's your assignment for the next few years. And here are my conclusions. Amen. Blessed be. And now we're going to do something. We're going to sing hymn number 1007 in the teal hymnal. There's a river flowing in my soul.